Welcome to the Likeville podcast. This is John Faithful Hamer. Today we're going to be talking with anthropologist Helga Ingeborg Vierich about a number of things, about sustainability, about the conflict between two visions that Charles Mann talks about in The Wizard and the Prophet, between those who say that we need to go back to some sort of pastoral or hunter-gatherer past, and those who say that technology can continue to save us as it has in the past. It's a very fascinating conversation. Helga has done extensive field research in the Kalahari Desert in Africa, and she has a lot of insights into what is possible for hunter-gatherer groups. And the question, as I'm sure you'll see, I am putting to her in many different ways is this a scaling issue? Can these lessons that we learn from hunter-gatherers can they tell us something about what human nature is like in a densely populated city or suburb? Or is it true that what you see there applies only to humans in very thinly populated areas? But anyway, before we get into the conversation with Helga, I just want to talk a little bit housekeeping issues. If you would like to support the podcast, please go to www.patreon.com and put in Likeville podcast. It costs us money to make these discussions, make these podcasts, and we could very much use your support. If you think this kind of content is worthwhile to have on the internet, where you have long-form discussions about important issues which aren't driven by gotcha journalism or some debate or pigeonholing everybody into this political stripe or that. If you think that kind of civil, intelligent, long-form conversation is worthwhile, well, please support it. If you cannot support it financially because you're a poor student or something like that, then there's other ways you can support the podcast. The title of the Facebook group is just Likeville, so if you type that into the search bar, you should find it. We put out a lot of new information about upcoming podcasts. You can submit questions that we will be sure to ask future guests. Also, the Likeville Twitter handle is at the Likeville Pod. It had to be shortened because of the character limits. You can follow us on Twitter. We also tend to put out a lot of information about what's happening in future interviews there. As you know, our main streaming location for the moment is on iTunes. However, if you aren't a big fan of Apple, I know many of you have a problem with Apple, you can listen to the podcast on overcast.fm. You can just go to overcast.fm and then type in Likeville, and it'll all pop up. This podcast is brought to you by Elsa's Bar in Plateau Montréal. It's a wonderful place. If you live in Montreal, you know this. It's a neighborhood place that people talk about all the time. If you're going to be in Montreal, I highly recommend you check out Elsa's. It's on Roy Street in Plateau Montréal. Fantastic place. This episode is also brought to you by Seb Furtado Photography. Sebastian is a professional fine art photographer who is offering private online one-on-one classes for those who want to drastically improve their skills in photography. And so he will show you completely how to use the camera, all the mechanics of how to do it. He'll teach you about light, about all these things. He'll also show you how to edit your photographs after to get them to be, their absolute best. And he's a fantastic teacher. If you go online, you can find all sorts of testimonials attesting to that fact. This podcast is also brought to you by Good Mix, which is a fantastic sort of organic paleo granola mix that you put inside yogurt and you have in the morning. And it's incredibly virtuous and very tasty, and it just fills you up for hours and hours. It's like a superfood, and it does fantastic things for your digestion. Highly recommend this stuff. And the podcast is also brought to you by our Patreon supporters. All right, without further ado, I give you Helga Ingeborg Vierich. Welcome to the Likeville podcast. This is John Faithful Hamer. Today we're going to be talking with Helga. How do you pronounce it? I've never been able to. Is it Vierich?
It's
Vierich?
Vierich or Vierich. I don't know.
Vierich. Helga Vierich,
Yeah.
an anthropologist and all-around fascinating person. So I'm just going to jump right in on this. I was interviewing Nassim Nicholas Taleb the other day, and he mentioned something in passing, and I immediately thought of you, and I thought, well, this is sort of a solution to a problem that sort of Helga has been talking about a lot. And it was a study of, and I'm blanking on the woman's name, but I went and actually looked at it after I talked to him, but it was a study of fisherman culture. And what they found is that when you have a certain number, when you have a small fishing community, they don't overfish. They sort of monitor themselves. But when you get above a certain size, then you have sort of the tragedy of the commons type situation, and you have people overfishing because they feel like, there's so many people in the water, I need to get mine to feed my family and take care of myself. And so suddenly people are not thinking about the good of the ecosystem or the good of the fishing community as a whole. They're just thinking, well, I just need to grab, what's mine as quickly as possible. And so his point was that a lot of the problems that we talk about are not so much a problem of human nature, they're a scaling problem. Right. So now my follow-up question to you about that, well, I want to get your reaction to that, but also you've done a lot of really intense research where you've gone and lived with communities, with hunter-gatherer communities, and these are obviously on a small scale, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, what can we learn from these communities, given the fact that they're so small and we live in something that's completely different? So, all right, Helga.
Okay. Well, first of all, is my sound okay?
Oh, it's perfect. Yeah.
Oh, excellent. All right. First of all, the notion of density is quite important here, okay? Density, and that, of course, pertains to the size of the community that is using the resource base, right? So it makes sense that if you have a very large, dense community, a sedentary community, a village of, 10,000 people, you're going to require a bigger resource base. You're going to need more access to more water if you're a fisherman. You're going to have much bigger access to a much larger area of forests for building your houses if you're going to use wood. You're going to need a much larger arable area if you are producing crops for your main food sources. So all of your material wants, as well as all of your food and water and so on, is going to increase in area when you have a large concentrated population. Okay. Now, the reason I bring that up is because there are people who argue that cities are much more ecologically sound because they concentrate human populations, and then the countryside can be sort of free of human interference.
That's pretty much the official environmentalist move. Like David Suzuki has talked extensively about how the real environmental solution is not back to the land people. It's actually get the hell off the land and leave it alone, let it go wild in many places, and that we have to have cities that are more like Tokyo, that are incredibly high, where we can have a lot of density so that we're not covering all the fields with concrete and having suburban sprawl and all that stuff. So yeah, I mean, that's like the official sort of, I don't know any environmentalists that are on the other side anymore. It used to be kind of split half and half, but.
Well, look at E.O. Wilson with his recent call to leave, what was it, a third or a half of the planet to what he calls nature. You can put a capital N on that.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, just exclude people, right? That's the idea. And this view, and the view espoused by many environmentalists like David Suzuki now, is not scientifically borne out. Okay,
Okay.
and the reason is because we are the gardeners of Eden.
Mm-hmm.
We are the people, we are the species that essentially shaped all the ecosystems on the planet. And
Mm-hmm.
we did North America and a bit later than everywhere else, but we imported, when we left the little tiny squirt of humans that got projected out of Africa during the last, 70, 80, I think it's probably more like 120,000 years, perhaps even more. But anyway, that little minority that formed this coastal culture along the East African and Southeast African coast during the great mega droughts that hit Africa. We know of ones that were very, very severe, between like 4 or 5 times, between 134,000,
Mm-hmm.
148,000, and about 74,000 years ago. Okay, and these were not like ordinary droughts. These are not even droughts that you can even imagine. These are droughts that left, Lake Malawi in Africa. That's one of the
Mm-hmm.
deepest lakes in Africa. I think it's actually one of the deepest lakes, that we know of. That lake was reduced to a kind of Death Valley with brackish little mud puddles here and there. It lost like 99% of its water. That's how severe these droughts were, and they lasted, 10,000. In some cases, they think it might be as much as 20,000 years. Now think about that. Where did humans originate? And what level of adaptation were we at the time when this was going on? And what
Mm-hmm.
we do know is that humans were spread all through Africa and all through Eurasia. We know that. And we know that they were very smart, that they already probably had boats or some kind of float technology to get out to islands. We know that they had, there's still some fuss about this, but I've looked at all the archaeological data and the paleontological data, and I'm now with this latest discovery of a 700,000-year-old human, I think it was a rhinoceros hunt or something in the Philippines.
Wow.
That was just in the last couple of months
I,
that
I didn't see that. I did. I mean, I read. I One of the people that I really like is Charles C. Mann, and I read his 1491, which
yes.
is just fascinating. And he sort of advances this an accessible, popularized version of the thesis you're talking about, and how the Amazon, which we look at and people thought, oh, this is just exactly what E.O. Wilson wants, right? Untrammeled wilderness, without human beings whatsoever. And he said, actually, you're looking at the remnants of a massive ancient garden
Mm-hmm.
that humans were specifically taking care of certain nut trees and fruit trees that were good for them, and where you're looking at basically an overgrown orchard in
Mm-hmm.
a farming region that went bust. Like.
And listen, this is true all over the world, except maybe the Arctic,
Mm-hmm.
But where you have trees, where you have plant species that are very, very important for subsistence for hunter-gatherers, okay?
Mm-hmm.
We're talking like, up to the Neolithic Revolution and the domestication of plants and animals, okay? And when we shuffle it around in our minds and rethink that paradigm of this kind of pristine wilderness where human beings were just kind of running around gathering the wild stuff and living off it, and not very well according to a lot of models, and we're kind of dumb people who didn't even know that they could domesticate plants, or that they would grow if they put seeds or tubers in the ground. They weren't. That isn't
Mm-hmm.
how humans,
Yeah.
hunter-gatherers all know this. They know this already. I mean, I watched them replant the nuts and the really important berries and some of the trees that they valued in the Kalahari. I watched them,
Yeah.
and women walking away. I went on maybe, I don't know altogether, but maybe 2 dozen gathering trips with women. I didn't like to impose too much and go and ask to go, so I only went when I was asked. And I think that was the right thing to do, because I noticed that sometimes they wanted to discuss stuff. Like they wanted to discuss their marriages or their husbands or some gossip that they really were comfortable discussing in front of me, right? So, you let a group of these very close female friends go off together when they have something to discuss, and you don't ask to go along, right? So I have, shall we say, a limited sample of observations of this, but in probably 80% of these trips, I noticed two things. One is I noticed women, as we were leaving, for instance, a stand of wild berries or of the very important marama nuts, which, by the way, are very tasty, which is a ground living tuber leguminous plant, okay, and it produces these hard nutty type beans, which they then roast and crack, and they're wonderful. Anyway, so as we're leaving these stands of various kinds of very nice berries or nuts, the women will sometimes casually remove a handful of these and just drop one here. As we're like a mile away, right? You drop one here, heel it into the ground. Drop one there, heel it into the ground. And it's not always going to give rise to a new stand. It's not always going to germinate, of course. But think of that. How many?
Oh yeah, I mean, all it takes is one to work, every couple of years to have a dramatic long-term effect on an ecosystem.
I estimated once that if these women were just each trip producing maybe 6 new plants, right? And if they have 2 or 3 trips a week, and if you think, okay, so how many women did I know who were gathering the whole time in this population? So I took it back and I said, okay, let's just estimate 100 women over 100 years in this little population. That's just a blank estimate. They would, if only half of those became new plants, they would have planted over 10 million. Okay, and that's just the lowest estimate. Where if I had tried the highest, it would have been hundreds of millions of new food plants generated and redistributed over the whole landscape.
Yeah, these symbiotic relationships are amazing. It's sort of like if you imagine a squirrel that had a really good memory and would remember every single place that he buried his nuts. That would be terrible for the environment, because we need them to bury a whole bunch of nuts that they forget about.
Well, that's the thing.
This is humans doing it consciously.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
And that was consciously. Now I'll tell you the second thing I noticed, right? And this is unconsciously. It's a kind of careless sloppiness, okay? These women would also dig up tubers. That was a very highly prized food, right? So when they saw a stand of plants that would have these tubers, they'd go to the young ones, because the older tubers were huge and hard to carry and all the rest of it, and sometimes a little more tough, as you can imagine, right? So every time they set down their whole big leather bag, their karosses, full of all this other stuff that they've already gathered, and they plunk it down on the ground, they go dig, right? And what I noticed, especially as it was getting towards the end of the gathering session, after like an hour or two, that there would be a little scruff of nuts and berries and things like that just sort of splattered out of the bag, at the edge of the bag. Okay?
Yeah.
And I was trying to be helpful at first. I would go, oh, goodness, right? Down.
You're trying to be all efficient.
Try to put it back, right? And the women laughed at me. They said, oh, don't worry about that. And part of it is because they always overgather. Like they try to fill their kaross as full as they can possibly carry. Some of these women were literally carrying, I know this is going to be hard to believe, but they had like 50 pounds. Like it was 25 kilo.
Wow.
I know. I weighed and measured. And these women, they had a tump line across their foreheads. And so they were straining. By the time that we got back into camp, they were sweating and they were exhausted. But they had these big grins on their face, and they plunked these big packages down. And they just went and rested, and all the other people, like the older women, in some cases it would be the younger women if the older women were gathering that day, but anyway, it would switch roles, right? Whoever was in camp, the men and the women, would sometimes come forward, and then they'd get the fire going a little hotter, and then they'd cook a meal really fast for everybody from all these gathered foods, like each household, like if it was the husband who was home with his kids, and his wife showed up, and he's got 3 kids, aged 11, 5, and whatever, some little guy. The little guy, of course, would go immediately, as mom lay down or sat down with a big sigh, he'd immediately go to her and nurse. Then the other 2 kids would help their dad get the fire going, and they'd cook a whole bunch of the stuff up, and everybody would have a snack right away. And that was an observable pattern over and over. Now, what these women did most of the time, and I asked them about this, and it was a strategy. They said, oh yeah, I know, we're tired, but this way we don't have to go out tomorrow. I mean, that's human nature, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like, okay, tomorrow I can rest in camp. They were very strong. That's all they could say. And there were times when it was more fun, and I think I talked about this in a paper once, but anyway, I'll just describe it. There's a kind of a worm. It's called the monato worm, and it's similar to the so-called mopani worm, which you see in the northern part of Botswana. This one was monato. It grew on nato trees, which are a subspecies of the trees in the north, and it ate the leaves, right? And it burrowed in the ground during the day, and then it would scurry up these trees at dawn and feed, and then go back down.
So is this the monato worm? Is this like basically a caterpillar?
Yeah, it's a great big fat grub,
Okay.
and it produces a monato. I'll have to send you a picture of the grub and the resulting insect. But anyway, so this great big fat grub. I mean, these are like the size of your. They're a bit longer. Well, I guess you've got a man's thumb, so it'd be about that size, right? But they're good size. They're like these witchetty grubs that they eat in Australia. Anyway, so on a day when we were going to go get these grubs, when we knew that it was the season, when they were already fat and it was time to gather them, they had actually camped close enough that they could make a day excursion of it, and everybody went. Even the little kids, like we all went. They borrowed like all the old little, cans of stuff that I brought with me. Everybody asked me for cans, and every bucket, everything that they could use to carry anything was taken along. In fact, that was the one time that women specifically told me to bring my camera bag without the camera. Okay. So, all right, so you can imagine this. So we get to this grove, and everybody is running around. The kids are all screaming and squealing and having great fun trying to catch these wiggly grubs, and they're filling all these containers, right? And of course, these grubs are going like, "Oh, what are you doing to us?" And they're trying to crawl, and so everybody's packing them back in and trying to keep them.
Oh my God! I found a picture of them online. Oh my God! That's crazy. Yeah. They say they taste like chicken, and they that's amazing.
No, it's like shrimp. Anyway, so then we hightail it back to camp. Like as basically everybody's walking like a maniac, but not running, because you've got 3-year-olds and stuff with us. Some people are carrying little babies, and so we're all and the kids have their little fat cans full of these things, and they're keeping their hands over them, and then they're going around and they're helping other people by taking grubs which are climbing down your basket or your bucket or your, in my case, my camera case, and stuffing them back in, and it's just like a circus. And so we're all laughing uproariously, and we get back to camp, and everybody puts down their grub collection, right? Mm-hmm. And fires have been built up before this, and they're sort of down to, hot coals, red glowing, all this kind of stuff. And everybody gets this ready. You clear the coals to the hot sand underneath, and they just threw bucket loads of these grubs right on the sand. And of course, the poor grubs, they go like, ugh! All of a sudden they're very stiff, I don't know, like a sudden death, and then they straighten out and become very stiff. And they're turned over a little bit, and then they're done, right? And then this is done over and over and over again, and the cooked grubs are collected in the baskets and all the other stuff that people have ready. And then the feast begins. Even while grubs are still being cooked on these open fires, everybody's eating as fast as they can. That everybody looks forward to. And it's like shrimp. And, to tell you the truth, I had a little thought. I thought, what about the intestines of these grubs? What's inside those? And should I be eating this? But everybody else was, so I did. And I figured in the end that whatever, digestive stuff, was in their tummies and do insects have stomachs? But anyway,
yeah.
Whatever was in there was okay. So these things, like I bit the little shiny black eyes and head off, the little mouthpiece, and almost everybody did that. They'd bite the head off and then they'd eat the whole grub. But, this is no worse than eating a shrimp. You've cooked it, stiff and dead, and you peel the carapace off it and take the legs off, and then you eat the, and it's no different. Right? People are going, oh, how could you do that?
Yeah, well, I did a Google search on it after you mentioned it. And there's all these different recipes.
Yeah,
like how to, and they tell you actually remove the guts and stuff like that, how to eat them. So, yeah, this is amazing.
I'll tell you an interesting story. Seretse Khama, who was the past president, he was the president of Botswana when I was there. And he had been, he'd been trained in England. I think he was a lawyer, but I may be wrong. Maybe he was at the London School of Economics. Anyway, wherever he was, I think it was law. He married his English receptionist or secretary named Ruth, right? So Ruth came to Botswana, and she was then the mother of the guy who succeeded Seretse Khama. I can't remember what his name is now, but as the next, not only chief of the Bamangwato, but also the chief, the president of the country. Okay, so here they are, in Gaborone, which is the capital of Botswana, and Ruth has one thing that she cannot abide, and it's grubs, right? So her husband would go out and he'd score a bunch of these at the local market because they're sold everywhere too, right? And he'd stuff his pockets and he'd get back and he'd be in his office or in the cabinet meeting or whatever it is, passing out these grubs. And once in a while there was this huge gossip thing would spread around the capital about how Ruth found grubs in his pocket again. And
that's hilarious.
I know it is. Yeah. Anyway,
it's like me with sardines. Like I just, Annalisa can't stand the smell of sardines, and she really hates it when it's on my breath. So whenever she goes away, I buy a bunch of sardines, and I'm like, this is like, I guess what other guys would, have like pornography or something. I'm like eating sardines,
I know,
stuffing my face, right? So this guy's eating grubs
that fill you with happiness, right?
Yeah. So he's eating grubs. That's his naughty food.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
And they're nice with a little salt. Anyway, so let's get back to the other thing. You mentioned Michael C. Mann.
Yeah.
And
Charles C. Mann. Yeah.
Charles C. Mann. I'm sorry. Climate change is all mixed up.
Yeah.
Anyway. So the thing is that the other thing that I noticed when I was gathering with these women was that they would also throw down these very tasty types of berries. There's a whole series of berries that are like currants and blackberries and Saskatoons and stuff like that on various trees, and there's wild plums, and all of this would get distributed. And one of the things I noticed was when people camped, right? Mm-hmm. They camp near one of the stands that, like, they would call it grandmother's stand, because it was their grandmother who had very likely seeded those. So the children, I remember interviewing, and I was hearing all this laughter and screaming, and it was quite distant. It was like 300 yards away. And I asked the lady, the granny that I was interviewing, I said, "Are they okay out there? They seem pretty far from camp." And she said, oh, they're in the berry bushes. They're pretending to be gathering adults, like adults who gather food. The little girls, that's what was happening. And so they were practicing, right? And they
Wow.
came back into camp with these little bundles in skin bags of fruits. And, they didn't even have to cook those, right? So then they'd sit around giggling and eating all of this, saying, essentially now we know how to be grown-ups.
Mm.
It was very sweet. But, it gave children something to do, something to practice, the familiarity. And you know what? Every culture on the planet does this. Children go out and gather wild berries. You notice that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We all did it, Like I gathered wild berries with a bunch of little friends up in North Bay, Ontario, in the suburb where I grew up. Behind it was still, wilderness. I mean, it was all this granite outcrops covered in blueberries, right?
Yeah.
And we used to go out there, and I can't remember how many times we saw bears, and it was just like, oh, okay, it's a bear. All right, well, let's just go the other way. And nobody was panicking about it. Well, when these little kids go out and do this, because they're quite close to the camp, the lions and the hyenas and leopards and stuff like that very rarely bother them, because it's sort of understood that there's a human camp here and it's best not to do anything. I also was really surprised at how little fear and avoidance most of the game showed when we were walking around the countryside like this. And I asked the hunters about it. And you probably remember this from the 1491 book by Charles C. Mann, that the game was treated in such a way that it did not have excessive fear of humans. They could be better managed that way, right? And they were hunted. Most of the North American hunter-gatherers used bows and arrows.
Mm-hmm.
Just think about what a bow is. It can be a death-dealing delivery system, right, of a lethal wound, but it's quiet.
Mm-hmm.
And it can strike from a great distance.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, relatively great distance. Okay, so the animal, like say you're walking through the woodland and 100 yards away there's some gazelle grazing or something like that. So you very quietly remove your bow and you take aim at one of them, and if you're lucky, you'll hit it. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The animals. I don't know if you've ever seen a bow of the kind that's used by Bushmen in the Kalahari, but they're tiny. They're like a little dart, They're
Really?
minuscule. And the trick is that they have very, very strong nerve poison applied.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so what happens is, and I've seen this, that the animal that's hit goes, oh, what was that? And then quite often the arrow might penetrate the skin, and there might be a little blood, but the animal will move and look around and maybe even pull the arrow out with its mouth, and it drops it. Sometimes it drops, the arrow hits and then drops off, just right there. Anyway, the animal isn't badly hurt. It's a tiny little wound. It's like it's been bitten by a sharp stick or something, right? And so then the other animals aren't that disturbed, and most importantly, they don't usually connect what just happened with the presence of a human being 100 yards away in some bush.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What this means is that unlike what happens when you hunt with spears and dogs and guns, which is noisy and obvious, right? Unlike that, they don't make the connection, and so they don't have a very long flight distance. So they actually, are not that frightened of humans. And this is another thing that I think a lot of people don't realize about hunting and gathering. Having some people gathering all the time in a particular area where they happen to be camped for like 6 weeks or something, versus having hunters go out, means that when animals see a group of humans wandering around, they may watch them for a while, but what they see is these animals are essentially interacting with the plants, like the other, harmless beastie, right? So they become accustomed to human presence in a way that that doesn't scare them.
Huh.
And then when the hunter goes out, even if it's two hunters together, and they're very, very quiet, and they just, they almost, the one guy told me the idea is to act unconcerned, and they did. They would be like browsing. They'd be picking not leaves necessarily, but if there were berries in a bush and they were watching some animals 100 yards away, they'd be eating these berries. If the animals notice them, they start eating these berries, and the animals go, oh, it's just more humans, right?
Yeah.
So at that point, you have an animal that you can get quite close to, and you can kill it, or rather you can start its demise in a way that is not going to connect the animals who remain behind. They're not going to make the connection, between the hunter and the eventual fact that this animal that had the pinprick wandered off and went to lie down somewhere.
They don't figure out the causation.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that animals, it takes many, I think there was an estimate recently, it takes about 7 generations for a prey species to lose what they call its predator fear. Okay, because information about how dangerous a certain creature is when it appears before you, that information is transmitted to the young. That's why, animals learn from their mothers, right?
Yeah.
It's not necessarily an instinctive thing. Particularly with larger predators, you can actually have rabbits become friends with dogs, whereas wolves and bunnies naturally are, that's not going to be the case.
I'm hearing my voice in your, I'm hearing myself in yours. I think maybe you can turn the volume down, or it's weird. It's just all of a sudden I started hearing you in the back, myself in the background.
Oh.
On your end. Oh, it looks like it's gone now.
Is that better?
Yeah, it's all gone. That was so weird. It just suddenly I was hearing a reverb or something. It was odd. Yeah. So I take it from what you're saying here that you don't buy into the sort of theory that humans exterminated most of the megafauna on all the different continents. You don't buy into that?
No, I think what happened more likely is that human beings, because of the way that they affect their ecosystems, they are kind of keystone species because they're ecological engineers. Okay? What that means is that they, for instance, the hunter-gatherers that I was with, as well as hunter-gatherers almost all around the world that have been studied, they will set little fires throughout their environment. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason for that is because, there are 3, but anyways, the main one is that prevents really, really dangerous wildfires. Because they're creating a mosaic where some of the area has very little fuel in it. Mm-hmm. Okay? And so even if a lightning strike starts a fire, that fire is going to run out of fuel pretty quickly.
Okay.
There's not going to be these vast amounts of dried vegetation for that fire to consume and become actually dangerous to the human beings in that environment or to the animals.
Yeah. No, I mean, Charles C. Mann talks about this a great deal. So does Yuval Harari in Sapiens and Homo Deus. Mm-hmm. The practice of burning, that's well known. But I guess the confusion that I have is that everything that I've read and looked at, it looks like the idea that we hunted a lot of the megafauna, it fits a lot of the facts, and it fits some strange facts. Like, for instance, the fact that the mammoth, there were still mammoths for thousands of years on a couple of large islands in the Arctic. And surprise, surprise, these are the islands where humans hadn't arrived yet. And as soon as you see human artifacts on that island, bam, the mammoth are gone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let me see if I can add some context and a more holistic view to that.
Okay.
One fact that you have to remember is that mammoths and much of the megafauna in Eurasia survived despite almost 1 million years of hunter-gatherer presence. Homo erectus was there, Neanderthals were there, this Denisovan population was in the eastern part of the Eurasian continent, and there were other populations of what we call archaic Homo in Africa, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's one fact. So if it's just a function of the way of having hunting humans around, why didn't they exterminate them earlier? Okay. All right. The second thing is that it is modern human hunter-gatherers who apparently hunt in this way that I was describing. I call it distance hunting. Okay. And they also do this environmental manipulation, ecological engineering, through the use of burning. Okay. There is no evidence whatsoever that the other archaic, sort of skeletally archaic groups of humans in Eurasia or Africa ever did this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, just think what we know about ecology, ecological systems. When you look at a pattern of burning, the way that hunter-gatherers do it, it actually changes the species composition, not only of animals, but of the plants upon which, they're dependent. The communities of plants become much more diverse, and the amount of plant matter that is in what we call secondary growth is increased. Okay? You get more berries. You get more open grasslands and meadows where you everything down. You get more species, like specific species of ungulates, which feed on lower bushes, do a lot of browsing and so on, as well as grazing in these secondary growth areas. In other words, what modern humans did when the ones that left, radiated out from Africa after, I don't know, 100,000 years ago, probably in small waves at first, but eventually in as kind of tidal wave because of just population growth along the coast. They changed the ecology. They changed the proportions of different ecosystems in their environment through their practices. Now that, I think, if you think about it enough, that might have been enough to reduce the vital habitat of certain megafauna to the point where they just got too low in numbers and went extinct.
Huh.
And this is it's not a crazy theory. And the second sort of aspect that I want to add to that is that in Africa, where I was, we had megafauna. These people were living with giraffes and big buffalo. And, they were not in the area where I happen to be anymore, but there were rhinos in the Kalahari, there's elephants, there's giraffes, and there's large mammal fauna. It had at the time that I was there, one of the highest biomass and diversity of mammal fauna on the planet. Okay, they'd been there for, I don't know, 100,000 years at least, off and on, right? So why weren't the giraffes and elephants wiped out in Africa before people went off to wipe them out in Eurasia and North America? It doesn't make sense.
Well, the theory that I've heard to respond to that is that because we evolved out of Africa, the animals in Africa had plenty of time to sort of learn how to deal with us and just sort of co-evolve with us. And the places where we had the most devastating effect are places like Australia or places like the Galapagos, places where we showed up and the animals there didn't have nearly enough time. We were very good at coming up with new hunting techniques, which we could pass on through language and culture, which gives us an incredible advantage over everything else in our ecosystem if we actually use that sort of information. But they didn't have enough time to evolve in a way to respond, and so that's what happened. And so the argument I've heard that the reason why you still have a lot of the megafauna in in Africa is precisely because they had a long time to respond to the development of us, right?
Well, I've heard that. I used to actually, I mean, I took a lot of courses in archaeology as well, and I read many of these theories about what happened, and that all changed when I did field work. Because what I think it was the opposite. I think it was that there's a certain amount of time that human beings need in an ecosystem to understand the complexity of it, the interrelationships in it, and to adjust their practices accordingly. It's not the animals that have to learn, it's us. Okay? Now, I related this. I don't know if I talked about it with you before, but I've said it to a number of people online and so on, and it's a part of the book that I'm writing. When I was in the Kalahari, I don't know if you've ever seen a film by John Marshall called The Hunters.
No.
In that film, he filmed a group of Bushmen men who shot with an arrow and so on a giraffe and followed it by tracking it across the landscape. And then when it was tired and cornered, and I guess the arrow poison might have had some effect, they brought it down and slaughtered it. And that was a very, very iconic film, and I saw it when I was an undergraduate. So when I got to the Kalahari and I was settling in among the Kwa and learning the language and, watching everything, I saw plenty of giraffes. I never saw them hunted. I asked about this. I said, well, so don't you ever hunt the giraffe? Or what about the eland? They were hardly ever hunting the eland either. And somebody explained to me that they wouldn't refuse an animal that offered itself, like that sort of stood there and broadside. They were fully armed with an arrow, but that rarely happened, and it wasn't God's will. And besides, God had put the giraffe there for a purpose. And I said, well, what do you mean? Like a dumb question. That's the purpose of anthropologists, to go to some place and ask all the dumb, obvious questions. Anyway, they referred me. They said, go talk to this woman. They named her, and they told me where to find her. And after a few more weeks, I eventually got around to visiting her camp, and I sat down with her, and my introductory remarks were, so tell me about giraffes. Because what I had heard was that she was, from a young age, just obsessed with giraffes. She really liked them. She wanted to know more about them. She was always looking at them. She was always discussing them. She drove everybody nuts on the subject of giraffes. It was just her thing. It was her little, the thing that she probably would have been a brilliant wildlife biologist if she'd gone up here. Anyway, so I said, okay, so, tell me about giraffes. Why don't you approve of your people hunting giraffes? And she gave me this very, very wise look. In fact, I don't know, is that like a Mr. Magoo look? And then she said, it's because the giraffe is the midwife of the acacia.
What's the acacia?
Well, if you've seen pictures of the Kalahari, they're these big sort of umbrella-shaped trees with a sort of fan out.
Mm-hmm. Of course, yeah.
Over, and you see them all over Africa. They're woody trees, they're long-lived, and they're found in semi-arid areas.
Yeah, it's like the iconic African tree, sort of,
That's
in
right.
pictures, yeah.
Big, flat-top tree.
Yeah.
Very tall, okay? So I go like, what do you mean? All right, obvious question. And so she said, well, the giraffe is the animal that is tall enough to have specialized. Well, she didn't say specialized, but, I took that as for granted. It's the animal made, is what she said. It was made by God to be tall enough to browse on the leaves and pods of the acacia. And the acacia babies, in other words, the seeds in the pods, pass through the midwife, the giraffe, and since giraffes have very large territories, they were deposited all over the landscape at very big distances from the parent tree.
That is wild.
Okay, all right. So I'm listening to this, and she said she had, of course, with her obsession, she had actually noticed young acacias sprouting from a place where a giraffe had left a dung heap.
That is just nuts.
Yeah, observational data. Plus, it turned out she repeated for me some mythology, some collected folk wisdom that had been passed down to her, and I guess she had always asked people for stories about giraffes, even if they were, like old mythology and sacred stories and so on. So she said that everything fit. Everything fit. So, at the time, I just thought, well, this is really funny, right? But then, you know what? I looked it up when I got back. And here's the deal. These acacias are legumes. They fix nitrogen. They have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria which live in their root area.
Mm-hmm.
Those bacteria fix nitrogen. Okay? Now, in semi-arid soils, particularly in sandy semi-arid soils that used to be big sand dunes during the mega droughts in Africa, those legumes do a vital thing. They make those soils more fertile, and they open up these areas to colonization by other kinds of plants that aren't legumes. So grasses can grow there. So, berry bushes of various kinds. So vegetative plants and tasty root plants can grow there. Okay? They make the desert into a savanna.
That is wild.
Wild, I know.
Yeah.
And you know what? I have discovered that there is actually research going on in Australia, for instance, about planting some of the native Australian legumes, which are a kind of acacia, a little thorny tree with that kind of frond and pod and everything, interplanted with food crops to keep the fertility up, because they make it unnecessary to apply chemical fertilizer, because that's just nitrogen, right? It's artificial chemical fertilizer. Most of the constituent is nitrogen. That's what's usually lacking in soils. So, this is actually a subject which the various institutes of agricultural research in semi-arid areas, particularly in the tropics, are becoming aware of. And of course, the North American native people who started to grow plants, and domesticate plants like the Iroquois, they had the three sisters.
Mm-hmm.
Beans, which is a nitrogen fixer, growing with the corn, which is a heavy nitrogen user, and also growing with the pumpkins and squashes.
Yeah.
Right? So the
descriptions in Samuel de Champlain's diaries, like the descriptions that he has of going to Huronia, and mm-hmm. just the really dense populations, big area, like they were able to support mm-hmm. these large populations. And he talks about just walking through fields and fields of pumpkins and all different kinds of squashes and corn. And then he estimated that they had enough grain stores and food in various like caves and other places to last for a couple of years, that they were really, really set up, despite the fact that they were, in what is now kind of central Ontario. It's not exactly the most, easy environment to survive in. It gets cold.
No.
Yeah, and they had turned it into this cornucopia of just an amazing mm-hmm. amount of food, right? It's mm-hmm. fascinating.
I know. And the same thing was done in the Amazon. The same thing was done in West Africa. I don't know if you were aware of this, but after I finished my PhD thesis, in fact, before I finished it, I got hired and eagerly accepted a job with a Green Revolution Institute.
Oh, wow.
To go to West Africa and study farming systems there. And I wanted to do two things. That's why I accepted this job. One is I wanted to understand the Green Revolution, what they were promoting, how it worked, and what was the effect on local indigenous agricultural systems and on their society. Because there had been some hints that it created more social stratification, right? And I was a bit concerned with this, but I also just deeply, deeply wanted to understand what caused people to shift from being foragers,
Mm-hmm.
to being to domesticating plants and becoming farmers and pastoralists. And so in West Africa, I was really privileged and lucky because I was able to study Fulani pastoralists in the northern part of Botswana. I was able to study three, actually four different groups of farming peoples who farmed at various intensities, and they were all in our study villages with the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics. So I was based at a research station, but I had these 6 villages, which myself and our economist was our rural economist was gathering data on. We had a sample of villagers that we were following all the years that we were working there, in terms of their inputs, the amount of labor they put in, whether they used any fertilizers, how fast were they adopting the green revolution techniques and technologies, and fertilizer and all this insecticide and so on, and what it was doing. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was like a dual purpose, and I had a lot of fun. India was great because the institute was based in India, and so I got to visit the big research station just outside of Hyderabad. I got to go to the Hyderabad study villages and see what was going on there. I got to stay for a week or two in Delhi between because my flight was delayed.
Mm-hmm.
And I just it was a really, really positive experience in some ways. Anyway, so
How did you square that with your sort of feeling that we should be doing more kind of the hunter-gatherer way, like the Green Revolution? Because those seem to me like to be the two diametrically opposed visions of the future that we have right now. There's,
technology.
yeah. I mean, that's it. There's Charles C. Mann's most recent book, which I highly recommend, although it's going to make you cry. I'm warning you. It is a very kind of upsetting book because it tears you in two. I mean, it's called The Wizard and the Prophet.
Yes.
And it's about Charles Borlaug and William Voigt. And he says very clearly at the beginning, he says, I'm just going to present these two different visions, and I'm not going to pretend that I know the answer. I find both of these visions extremely compelling, and they make a lot of good points, and I have no idea how to reconcile them. And so on the one hand, there's the Voigt vision, which is sort of very similar to what you're saying we need to kind of go backwards. We need to work with the land. We need to go back. We need to, and then you have Borlaug, who is the one, of course, who is pretty much single-handedly responsible for the Green Revolution. He's the one who came up with the high-yield crops and came up with the whole using artificial fertilizers. And he says, he goes, I've been agonizing writing this book for a long time, and I have not heard any of the Voigtians, and I would guess you'd be a Voigtian. He said, I have not met one Voigtian that can sort of dispel this simple fact, which is that the estimates are that 3 out of every 5 humans on planet Earth right now are alive because of Norman Borlaug, because of his agricultural techniques.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, here's a shocker for you. I actually met Norman Borlaug.
No, really?
Yeah, he was in Africa.
That's
he
nuts.
was doing a project, with USAID, I think, if I remember. The details are fuzzy because this was like 20 some years ago. But I met him, and there was some seminar. I can't even remember. It's all hazy in my mind because I was so tired. I'd just come back from one of the study villages. And he told me 2 very interesting things. Well, first of all, I'll give you my impression of the man.
Please do.
Very, very kind. He was very, very troubled. He loved children, and he didn't like to see, he didn't like the feeling that there were starving children in the world. Mm-hmm. He didn't see people be poor. He didn't want to see, he called it the waste of human beings. To people who have inadequate nutrition, inadequate opportunities to shine. Everybody has something to contribute, was one of the things he said. And that was his life work, to make it possible for all these, for people to survive their childhoods. The other thing he said was that, and by the way, I looked this up, and he actually said this in his Nobel acceptance speech as well. He said, all I did was give us time to get the population under control. Okay. And I'm not sure. I mean, I haven't met his daughter, who I guess is carrying on his work, and she's really a strong proponent of genetically modified organisms, and so on. And she's sort of carrying on. I guess there's an institute that he founded or something. But what he said to me, because our institute, the geneticists and plant breeders at ICRISAT, the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics, is called by the name at ICRISAT. Anyway, what they said was that this was going to revolutionize everything, because they could then see that they could put into the main food crops in the semi-arid tropics greater drought tolerance. They could reduce what they call the verbage, the vegetation aspect, and have the plant just concentrate on producing new seeds.
Yeah.
Known from some very fast developing desert plants that they don't. Well, anyway, it's a long story, but we discussed it, and they were very optimistic. It was just beginning then. Nobody had ever actually done it, okay, when I was there. But, it didn't seem like at all a bad thing, And then later on, years later, I heard about golden rice, and some of the people I was still corresponding with at a sister institute called E30, the International Rice Research Institute. They were actually, doing trials of this. And the golden rice was supposed to supply missing vitamin A, and I guess they put some kind of, maybe carrot genetics or something into the rice, and they turned it golden. But they've never been able to release it, because in the first place it doesn't quite do it nutritionally. Like, you can feed a person a lot of golden rice, and the vitamin A isn't that available to their bodies. It doesn't get digested in the way that they thought it would. All of our digestion is breakdown products, right?
Yeah.
Still not sure. I mean, I guess it's now been recognized in the United States as a potential type of rice and all the rest of it. But you see, the other thing that I remember one of the people at the Institute saying to me, he said, well, this is all very well, but the reason that people are deficient in vitamin A is because a lot of poor people don't have enough land to grow green leafy vegetables, or the kinds of root crops that actually supply those nutrients. The problem is poverty. It's not that the rice is inadequate. Poverty, and so I had that sort of information rattling around in my brain for many, many years without really articulating it. But lately there's been a lot of fuss about GMOs, and I think, gosh, if we could genetically manipulate the chestnut tree, the North American chestnut tree, so it was no longer subject to the onslaught of the pest that wiped most of them out, it would be really great. There are lots of good things that could be done with it, but as to saying you have to support GMOs, scientific agriculture will save the world, it will feed the world, we're not going to be doing it without this. That is hype. I'm sorry, because the main reason that people were not eating adequately and did not have enough food was poverty. That's what I found out in West Africa.
Yeah. I'm very skeptical of GMOs for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned. I think GMOs in theory, I think it could be a good idea, but when you have companies like Monsanto, well, now Bayer, when you have companies like that running the show, it's really hard to expect to have a just and reasonable result when you have such evil empire type people like, making the decisions. But I do wrestle with this, and I definitely Charles Mann is one of the books that has sort of put this under me, but also Yuval Harari in his book Homo Deus, he talks about this a great deal, and he says there are all sorts of areas in the world. I mean, let's take just Europe, for instance. If you look at the population of Scandinavia, or the population of, let's say, Ireland, right? It had a very low population density for a long time, and the people that were there were able to manage a pretty large territory, right? But then along comes the potato, right, which is brought over as part of the Columbian Exchange. And this one crop, because it can produce just massive yields, made it possible for populations to explode in places like Ireland and Finland and Sweden. So you had population densities like you had never ever seen before in that area, right? So now those people, if you go and measure them, well, they're not very healthy, and they have these nutritional, but they're there because of this crop. Right, so if you have an advance in rice production or potato production or wheat production, it allows to have this huge population explosion. But now those people are perhaps not getting as good of a diet. But what do you do with all of those people? Right, what do you do with all those people now? I mean, I asked an environmentalist in an interview. I was quite sort of shocked by the answer. I said, somebody who's a real sort of Voitian, said, well, what do we do with all these billions of people that we have? I mean, we can't all go back to the land and spread out. There's just too many of us, right? So what do we do? And her response was, well, we need to just forcibly sterilize, about 80 or 90% of the world's population. We have to decide we have to keep certain people based on certain criteria, and we have to drastically reduce the human population down to below 1 billion by, I think she said by like 2050 or something like that. And I just thought, okay, first of all, that sounded pretty creepy and middle 20th century-ish, but also good luck with that. I mean, like, how are you going to, why would any democracy go along with that?
Well, first of all, who gets to be reproducing and who doesn't, right? That decision. And you just know that that's not going to be done on the basis of, genetic quality or anything. Right? I mean, really. And then what else are you going to use? So, and the other thing is that we're going to, if that happens, then the genetic diversity, which is already very low in Homo sapiens as a species, right? That genetic diversity is going to be narrowed again. It's going to produce an artificial bottleneck. And for all you know, the people who wind up being able to reproduce happen to carry a lot of deleterious, chromosomes or alleles, which will cause genetic syndromes and so on to explode in the generations after that. We don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's just I guess what I'm getting at is that if we have a solution, right? Well, to go back to the original point about what Nassim Nicholas Taleb was talking about, how, and this is a main point in Anti-Fragile, and it's also a main point in his new book, Skin in the Game, that scale matters, right? You can't just, something that is true in a small town is not necessarily going to be true in a city, and something that's true of a city isn't necessarily going to be true of a nation state. That as you scale things up, some things that work when a community is small just don't work anymore once it gets to a certain size. And I can even see that in a strange way right here in the middle of Montreal. If I'm walking in a big nature park in Montreal, and there's a lot of them, they're very large parks in Montreal, and if I'm walking in a park and I pass somebody on the path, we will immediately make eye contact and say hello. Right?
Mm-hmm.
This is just, it's automatic, just because the density of humans in the park is low enough that we suddenly greet each other as fellow humans, right? But I can pass that person, 20 minutes later on the city streets, and we would not make eye contact and say hello, right? So even the exact same two people in this area, once you have a scaling issue, right? So I guess my point is that if you're learning about humanity from small towns or from hunter-gatherers or from families, right? To what extent is that knowledge useful in solving the problems that we have in mass societies? I mean, do you think the solutions scale, I guess I'm saying?
Well, yes and no. I think that density and scale involves power laws. In other words, there's a point where you reach a trigger where the kind of interactions that are possible in a low population little village or hamlet or something, small community, become too costly for individuals. I mean, if everybody shopping at the Safeway or local grocery store were to spend a bit of time greeting each other, asking after each other's families, getting to know each other, nobody ever get anything done.
Oh, it'd be exhausting.
Yeah. And so there's what we understand about human beings is that there's a cost to maintaining our networks of relatives and friends. And it's not just a time cost, it's also a physical effort that's involved. You expend energy having conversations with people, and you expend time and money and energy socializing. The coffee clutch, the dinner invitations, the things that people really love to do, socialize. We can't do it with every person we see. We've only got so many people that we could spend time with.
Yeah.
Or we just run out of, we can't bother to take a shower or change our clothes or
Yeah.
clean your house because we're so busy talking and socializing with everybody we meet that you have no life then, right? So there's a kind of power law there, okay, and it relates to scale and numbers of people. And of course, you probably know the research that was done some years ago, which indicated that everybody has a certain number of friends and relatives in their network, individual network size. And there was a man in England, Robin Dunbar, who created what we now call Dunbar's number, and that's something under 200. The sort of average is about 150. Okay?
Yeah, I remember hearing that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so these networks, they involve an inner circle of real good buds that you talk to all the time, and that can change, in seasonally. Like there are times when you talk a lot to your students, and then you may never see them again, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the time, they're in your network. You know who they are. You know their stories. You spend a lot of energy and effort on them. And often those relationships will persist in the sense that if that student comes back in 10 years' time, you will make the effort to have dinner with them and talk to them for maybe even days.
Yeah.
And this is true of relatives and friends as well. But there's a kind of upper limit to how many people you can have in that inner, proximate circle and spend time with from week in, week out, and how many people you can kind of keep track of over the course of, say, a 10-year period. Well enough to remember to phone them on their birthday, maybe send them a present at Christmas, or at least, send them a Christmas card. And so
Yeah.
and the thing is that I don't know what Dunbar is doing now, but I can imagine that he's probably looking at overlapping networks. In other words, we have networks. Each individual person that I know, anyways, has a network of friends and family which persist most of their lives. They, like for instance, I have a friend that I knew in high school, believe it or not.
Mm-hmm.
Her name's Mary Jane. She used to be Mary Jane Hodder, I think, and now she's Mary Jane St. Ange, and she still lives near North Bay. She has a number of children, and believe it or not, one of her children is a professor at Nipissing College, and what he writes about and works on, his name is Jeremy St. Ange, he does permaculture and ecological, kind of an ecological futurism to, how are we going to adapt when things change, because they are going to change with, the impending crises that are looming before us. It's not just population, it's the system of agriculture, it's the rate of species extinction, it's the amount of soil that is being destroyed by our present system of mechanical, agriculture that the Green Revolution ushered in.
Mm-hmm.
The estimates now among soil scientists is that we've got at most another 50 years, 60 years before the kind of agriculture we're doing now is going to just not be possible anymore, because there won't be enough soil left.
Yeah.
That's great, the rates of dust.
Yeah, no, I mean, he lays all of these facts out in that book, The Wizard and the Prophet, and he says, basically, we've been playing this game of kind of like an arms race, where every time it looks like we're about to go off the cliff, there's a brand new invention which sort of vastly sort of extends, right? So one of the things he does in the book is he looks at all of these environmental apocalypse books that came out in the 1960s and 70s, and how, we're not going to make it to 1990, and he explains precisely why they were wrong. And he says the main reason why they were wrong is that we have again and again, we're like very smart little critters, like we've come up with new inventions which have sort of forestalled the seemingly inevitable. But he says at this point we're really out of tricks, and there's some really kind of big problems that we're heading towards. And he said everybody I've spoken to, hardcore sort of Borlaugians, who they're the wizards. They really think we can sort of invent our way out of any problem, right? The wizards that he interviewed were saying, we got nothing. We're freaking out, Yeah. So you think this guy says permaculture is the way to get around this?
Let's put it this way. I'm just going to back us up here for a minute. When we look at the human story, okay, a lot of people don't ground that within nature. They don't ground our existence within the natural ecosystem of this planet. There's an artificial divide that is kind of a dualism that people have in their heads. And you see this with E.O. Wilson's suggestion that, the human world gets sort of cut off and leaves the rest of the world to nature. You get it with people who want to put every human in cities, right, where it's very efficient because you can bring in food and distribute it without any more further transport, all this kind of stuff. I can see the efficiencies of scale making larger and larger companies more efficient. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
More economical. Okay, so that you actually spend less money getting a peach on your dinner table, and the peach is cheaper if it's brought to you by a large international agricultural firm that has, plantations all over the world and can get you the peaches at the best time in a timely fashion with all this transport and everything. Yes, but we leave out a huge cost. Okay, and that cost is to the ecosystems that support this population of humans on this planet. We almost think, some of the so-called wizards, I think. In fact, come to think of it, here's another aside. I guess when I went to West Africa to work for Green Revolution Institute, it was wizard culture that I wanted to understand.
So you were being an anthropologist among the Green Revolution wizards, yeah.
That's a big part of what I learned,
Yeah.
I'll tell you one thing about wizard culture. They are like Norman Borlaug. I didn't meet anybody at Icresat who was an evil person, or even a hypocrite, or a person who was mostly concerned about making their own name and stuff. Most of these people were immensely sincere and genuine in their efforts to do something about poverty and hunger. Okay.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you something else. I don't even think that the people at places like Bayer and Monsanto, most of the people who are researching in those institutions, those corporations, like the labs that they have for, GMOs and all the rest of it, I don't think those people are evil either. I think what it is it's an evil machinery. It's an evil infrastructure because it assumes a paradigm which is inaccurate. Okay, and that paradigm is that we can impose another nature that is just a human-controlled mechanical system that is going to be separate from the world's natural ecosystems, and that will take care of our problems. And I don't think that's productive in the long run. I think that's why we're dealing with this rate of species extinction, we're dealing with this rate of soil loss, we're dealing with a lot of other problems. And the ecological perspective that sees humans as part of nature, as embedded in nature, is much more complex. It's much more difficult to get a handle on, for your average person. It's much easier to go, okay, we can solve this problem of vitamin A deficiency with a type of rice that has, that's a kind of very straight line, but in fact, nature isn't like that. Our ecosystem isn't like that. And even the definition of the problem is too simple. It's too linear. Okay.
Yeah.
And so when you situate humanity within the planetary ecosystem, and you see us for what we are a keystone species, okay? We create the very ecosystems that support us. When we're hunter-gatherers, we do it. When we're farmers, we do it. Even when we're people who live in cities, we're doing it. The only thing is that we haven't had time to learn how to do high-density stuff without hurting the ecosystem. And I don't have like 100% answer to that either. I do know one thing, and that is that what I observed in the kind of farming that was being done traditionally in parts of these parts of Africa that Icresat was trying to help, that farming was not failing. That system was not failing. And these, the Mossy Plateau in Burkina Faso is quite heavily populated. They're a traditional tribal chiefdom. They have a paramount chief, the Mohanaba, okay? And there's millions of people there. But yet, when you try to figure out what's causing starvation periodically, it's the breakdown of social risk management systems, okay? And why is that breaking down? Because the land and effort that used to be allocated to producing a surplus, which was centrally stored against a hard drought season or something, surpluses are now being used to generate other kinds of crops like bananas or peanuts or something like that can be, and cotton is a big one, that can be sold internationally. And you can only, like, if you've lived for 1,000 years as a small farming community where you're using out of maybe 350 acres in the village territory, you're using 10 acres or 20 acres a year. 20%. No, that was too low. So say, 50 acres, right? You're using about 20% of your village territory to produce food. That means, just in the terms of the realities of secondary growth, that when your land becomes infertile because of the nutrients that are taken out and eaten by you, right? When that land becomes too infertile to give much yield, you abandon it. It's a long fallow system, so it returns to the commons. Okay, and what happens then is that the grasses move in. First the annual pioneering plants, grasses and little bushes and stuff, and then the bigger bushes that are perennials come in. The perennial grasses come in, and small pioneering trees come in. And among these are small acacia and legume trees, because they fix nitrogen naturally and they can restore fertility naturally. Okay, and all of these plants are seen as good by these people, and they leave them alone. What we do is we call them weeds.
Yeah.
So we don't even let them get to the point where they're restoring much, because we spray them and stuff. But anyway, so when we have a lot of weed invasion on a field that's been cultivated for 20 years, that's a sign that it's not just nitrogen. There are other nutrients that do not favor the plant you're trying to make into a crop, but do favor dandelions or some of these deeper rooted species of weeds, or the fast growing fleshy types of weeds like pigweed, and which is a type of amaranth, I guess, and what's the other one that's so common? Lamb's quarters. You see those all over the agricultural areas as weeds. And there's a whole bunch of other species as well, but those are some of the main ones. And those plants do really, really well in competition with our food crops, because they require fewer nutrients, and they grow really fast. And in the case of legumes, wild legumes, they actually have a nitrogen fixing quality. Why do you think alfalfa is such a main crop for fodder? It's because it's legume.
Yeah. What's interesting is with crops like that and plants like that is that very often, once the land recovers, those plants are gone. Like they basically, they survive and they thrive on distressed soils, on distressed land. Like, I mean, the classic example right here that I see all the time in Montreal is one of my favorite plants is greater burdock. It's a absolutely gorgeous plant, and they grow on distressed land, and they put down incredibly deep roots. They bring up all sorts of minerals that pretty much nothing else would be able to go that far down, except for maybe trees. And they produce a phenomenal amount of nectar, and like for all this stuff, like 1, 2, or 3-year-old greater burdock plant can, my calculations from observing them sometimes for hours and hours and hours, is I think they produce enough food to support an entire beehive. It's that productive, right? And so they end up enriching the soils like crazy. And then, but as the forest comes back, suddenly the burdock is all gone. It just can't grow. And so this is why I got into a real argument with this very Voitian environmental group here in Montreal that they call themselves Friends of the Mountain. And they, on a regular basis, they've got a real hate-on for invasive species, right? They have this idea that whatever that was there first is the only thing that belongs there. And they would go around Mount Royal Park and rip up all this greater burdock and burn it, because they said it's an invasive species, when in fact it really helps the native species like crazy. It replenishes the soils, and then as soon as the native species are big enough, it's gone. I mean, it just like...
Well, people consider it a weed, and a weed is a plant that you can't exploit commercially. It's something that doesn't look good.
Yeah, it's like, what is it? Mary Douglas, her wonderful description of dirt. It's matter out of place. So
Yeah.
we could sort of we could take that and say that, well, a weed is basically a plant out of place, right? It's like something it's not doing what you want it to do, right?
Mhm. Well, people have also this vision of order, right?
Mm-hmm.
Order is a big thing with landscapers. And to have a natural ecosystem succession community is very messy. I mean, when you see old farms that are growing back, that people have kind of, in some cases, there's actually a couple in England who have like 3,000 acres or something, and they just let everything grow back. They
Wow.
do cultivating. And what's amazing there is that all these insects and songbirds and all kinds of other wildlife is now just burgeoning on this property. But all the surrounding farmers are pissed off because they find it untidy.
Oh, it's more than just tidy. I know a friend of mine lives in farming area in southwestern Quebec, and there's a lot of apple orchards there.
Mm-hmm.
And he said it's really, really annoying when you have one orchard that decides they're going to go organic and they're not going to use any pesticides or herbicides or anything, because that one farm suddenly becomes a hotbed for tons and tons of pesticides and things like that, like
Mm-hmm.
start to proliferate on that particular plot of land, and then that means that all the people around that person end up having to use way more pesticides and herbicides than they normally would, because they are it was very shocking to me. I never thought of, I always thought of organic farmers as these just
Yeah.
100% good thing,
Of course.
and he said no, actually they're freeloaders. They're total, like, it's the free rider problem. He said organic farmers are sort of like hippie pacifists, right? You're benefiting from the order provided by the outer structure. Like, you wouldn't be able to do that in northern Mexico, a little out of Juarez. You wouldn't be able to have like a hippie pacifist commune there where there's like armed thugs going around on a regular basis. So you're basically benefiting from the order provided by the
Yeah.
structure. And so I said, well, is it always that way? And he said, well, not always, but it requires like a recovery time. So basically, he gave me an example. He said in Vermont, there's places where they have a bunch of organic farms all together,
Mm-hmm.
and essentially they have exactly what you're saying. There's this intermediate period, which can be 5 years. It could even be 10 years, where it's really ugly, and you
Mm-hmm.
get low yields, but eventually. Not only is the area recolonized by all the pests, it's recolonized by the things that eat the pests.
Exactly.
And that's when things calm down. But, you got to make sure you're not bankrupt by then.
Yeah. Well, you see, your point about bankruptcy, or his point about bankruptcy, is actually key, because most farms now are commercial. They're businesses. Okay. And the whole point of having an apple orchard is to have enough apples to sell. And all the apple orchards that are controlling their weeds and their bugs and everything else, they're trying to maximize the number of unblemished, unwormy apples
Mm-hmm.
that they're bringing to market, because otherwise their profits are going to go down and they may lose their farm, right? And that's a different kind of farming from subsistence farming. It
Yeah.
really, because in the people that I was describing, when they let their land go fallow and everything grew back and secondary growth happened, right? What happened was that they just let it became part of the commons. They were able to graze their goats and cattle there. Some of the secondary growth plants were productive of berries and nuts, and so people would go there and gather. As the secondary growth went through its stages, and these landscapes would be left not untouched, but uncultivated, uncleared, for up to 35 years.
Wow.
Oh, yes, that's what they
Yeah.
mean by long fallow. At the end of that period, you have climax species coming in, young trees of various kinds, which are characteristic of a climax community.
Yeah, like beech trees
Oh.
and things like that. Yeah.
And what happens is that the climax community, I don't know if you know this, but most ecologists have often described climax forest as a biological desert.
I haven't heard that before.
All of the nutrients, a lot of the carbon is bound up in these huge long-lived trees.
Hmm.
There's
I
life.
mean, I've definitely noticed that in places where it's really obvious. Like if you go to the Pine Barrens
Yeah.
in New Jersey, or actually
Mhm.
basically the Pine Barrens that exist in that wide swath all the way down to North Carolina, actually, you can see. I mean, there it's very obvious because these pine trees, they have literally poisoned the soil. They've
Yeah.
acidified the soil so much that they're basically the only thing that can live in it.
It's like a
And
wild
this soil
forest.
has become just this, there's like some ferns and stuff like that. And so the biodiversity in those pine barrens is quite low. So no, I can see what you're talking about.
So, what happens is that, trees, each individual tree just wants to live long and prosper. There's lots of baby trees, right? And so, what they benefit are the kinds of birds and to some extent small mammals, like some of these little leaping primates, that will eat their seeds and distribute them just like the giraffes do, right? Far away. Because seeds that drop right under the parent tree, particularly if it's a well-developed tree and it's older, they have very little chance of ever growing into anything. So the tree, these kinds of canopy forests will have a biomass of the kinds of species of birds and primates, and I guess insects too, that benefit and interact with their own ecology in a beneficial way.
Hmm.
But the messy stages before you get to climax have far more species diversity. They have far more, shall we say, clever strategies to get their fruits eaten and taken away because they're in
Hmm.
competition with a lot of others that are trying to do the same thing. And because they're pioneering species, the whole point is that they're less long-lived, so they put a lot more effort into, plant energy or whatever plants do into into reproducing successfully. So they have a lot more fruit, they have a lot more nuts, they have, a very high proportion of matter, like energy, invested in their seeds because they want animals to come and eat those and take them away.
Yeah.
So it's in secondary growth that you get grapes, that you get plums and apricots and oranges and mangoes and all these papayas, all these really really interesting tropical fruits. Banana is a pioneering species.
Yeah. This completely fits with your original point
Yeah.
about that we didn't necessarily hunt the megafauna to death, that we altered the environment from old
Yeah.
growth forests and old growth
Yeah.
so much that these things just were they didn't. I mean, what we do is not entirely dissimilar to what I've seen beavers do. I mean, I've seen in a big plot of land that I knew very very well, knew like the back of my hand, a
Mhm.
farm. And a friend of mine, she decided she was just going to she's a a very good friend of David Suzuki's. Actually, she's written a number of books with him, and she decided she was going to just let a lot of her land go wild, exactly the way David said should happen. And immediately what happened is some beavers came in and they dammed up some little streams. And I mean, it's just phenomenal. I don't think there's anything other than humans that can any other animal that can alter a landscape uh,
As quick.
quite. Beavers are just unbelievable. So the whole area is flooded, and immediately all of these, just hundreds of trees die, and they're
Mhm.
just like these sort of gray skeletons sitting in
Mhm.
this stagnant mosquito-filled water. And so the
Mhm.
trees all die, and all these species that were there on the farm that you would see on a regular basis, suddenly you're not seeing them anymore. But you're getting all these new species. All these birds are coming in, all these frogs, all these salamanders, all these, martins, and all these different things are coming in. So, yeah, I mean, and the beavers are doing that. They're altering the landscape precisely because it's more congenial to them, right? So we're kind of doing the same thing.
Beavers really eat secondary growth plants. So they're setting the succession back. They're killing off the older growth forest and producing a lot of swamp and extra flooding because that promotes things like willow and and birch and a lot of these species that live around water,
Which they really like. They're farming the landscape. They're permaculturing the landscape, right? So, yeah.
I know, but the immediate effect of a hunter-gatherer, I've seen this in the Kalahari, the immediate effect that you feel when you see an area of half a mile square that has just been recently burned, okay, is total devastation. I mean, it's horrible, right? You just think, oh my God, how could they do this? Right?
Yeah.
And then 2 weeks later, even if it hasn't rained, one of the most amazing things that happens is the grass has this flush of growth. The roots, the permanent grasses, they're called C4 grasses. They have another kind of metabolism, and most of them form these permanent tussocks, right? And they're very prolific, and they green the whole thing. The whole landscape suddenly turns emerald, and this is without rain.
Wow.
And so then the wildlife responds to this. They go there specifically to graze on all this new growth, which has been flushed out by the fire. Well, of course, the fire also releases nutrients, because a lot of carbon goes into the soil, a lot of the nitrogen that's been tied up in plant wood and withered grass and stuff. That all gets not all. Some of it, of course, goes up in smoke, but there's a flush of nutrients, a flush of new growth, and that attracts animals. There are species like the sable antelope, for instance, that actually seek out recent burned areas because they like to have their calves there. Because the little calves lying among a lot of burned vegetation and, carbonated like ash and stuff, their smell is completely covered.
Wow.
It's susceptible to predators, and they blend right in with the burned vegetation. They're quite dark when they're born. And so, and that's one of the reasons they're sable antelopes, they're dark animals. So the whole herd can actually lie down and have a siesta on a burned patch, and you can barely see them.
That's amazing.
Among all the sticks and everything and all the piles of blackened ash and charcoal. And so, there's also the fact that animals come to lick the ash because there's nutrients in ash that they need. Salt, various kinds of mineral salts and so on. And so when you're a hunter-gatherer and you want to produce an ecosystem that has a lot of diversity, that is like a mosaic of recent cleared areas like these burned patches and various kinds of secondary growth where everything's growing back from that charred condition, and some areas in climax and some areas in advanced secondary growth where it's like a dense woodland, and you produce a mosaic of that, and all of a sudden you've got a much higher diversity of different species of animals, insects, and plants in your range,
That's wild.
And you find more gather, you have more opportunities to hunt medium-sized animals, and you also increase the kind of health of the environment because you've got, first of all, the diversity, but secondly, what that does is it brings in a lot of predators who have an easier time because they've got a lot of species that they can hunt, and that increases the health of the animals. Do you know, just as I'm going to put another footnote on here. Right now in North America, there's a great big panic among wildlife biologists over the onset, which started over 20 years ago, of something which is like BSE. It's a prion disease that causes chronic wasting of deer, and it's affecting mostly whitetail, but it also affects elk, wapiti, and it moose. Okay, now there's in the Midwest there are several big patches where it would actually be really stupid to go and hunt for venison because it has these prion diseases, and we don't know. I mean, right now a lot of wildlife people are saying no, it's safe to eat, we won't get it, but they also said that about adding scrapie infected sheep, which have a prion disease, to the feed, cooking them up and adding them to the feed.
That's how you got mad cow disease.
Yeah. But we don't know. Like prions occur naturally in our brains. They're part of our brain communication and scaffolding system and everything. And they're a protein, basically. They're a protein that should be always folded a certain way. And when they're folded the wrong way, they cause a disease. They can destroy the brain. They can destroy your nervous system. And that's what these people who died of BSE diseases, wasting diseases in England had, right? Mm-hmm. Well, I haven't seen that in North America related to the deer, but it gives one pause. Well, here's the interesting thing about that. Predators like cougar and wolves are not susceptible to this. They've been predators for so many millions of years that they've developed some way of, preventing misfolded proteins from getting, reintegrated into their system or something. Who knows?
Well, I guess they basically, with the higher acidity within their stomachs, they probably can digest them.
We don't know. In any event, when you have enough predators in among this population of deer that are affected by prion diseases, the predators differentially take the sick animals out.
Wow.
Okay. Now, there's another thing that's been noticed about prion diseases, and that is that there's a higher amount of magnesium. It's magnesium, I think, compared to copper ions in the soils and in the folded protein. Okay, what that means is that the protein molecule will prefer to have a copper molecule, and it'll fold the right way. But if it doesn't have a hot copper, and if it can easily find a magnesium molecule instead, or atom instead, it'll take that, but it'll fold it the wrong way.
That's exactly like lead poisoning in poor neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, because if a kid is getting proper nutrition, they're eating like lots of raw broccoli and lots of things like that. There are other minerals which will bond, and that place will basically be taken. And so even if the kid does eat some lead paint, the vast majority of it is just going to pass right through their body. It's the malnutritioned kids who are living off of Twinkies or something like that, that if they have the paint, because they're missing that mineral, it will bond, and that's where you get all the damage. That is fascinating. So this is like a very broad problem in the animal world.
Yeah. And so you see, if human beings, say you're a hunter-gatherer, and say that you promote this kind of ecological mosaic, right, with all these different species, you're not going to be differentially going out and shooting the pine martens and the raccoons and the coyotes and the wolves and the foxes and the other little predators that kill smaller things. You're not going to be shooting the wolves and the bears that are preying on or the big cats, the cougars, that are preying on your deer. Because if you do that, you wind up with more sick deer. And the thing that's really interesting about this is, believe it or not, Farley Mowat, when he wrote The People of the Deer, and he interviewed Inuit about that.
I read that when I was a kid.
They told him that. They said that the wolves husband the deer, that the predators were necessary to keep the deer healthy.
Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know. But a lot of things that science and, in-depth, honest, even ethnographic work like I did, I think, show us is that there's a deep ecological complexity partly understood by people who've lived in the landscape a long, long time, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so when you look at what that old lady told me about the giraffe, right? There are generations, probably thousands of generations of observation and discussion, hypothesis forming, further observation, arguments, backing that information up. She is the product of a long history with that piece of megafauna. And she has, her views are backed up by all kinds of memes, of like proverbs and stories, and the fact that the animal is considered sacred and you don't hunt them on purpose, right?
Yeah.
Those kinds of things. And so when you look at the sacred animals that we have in other places, like why, for instance, did the Plains Indian consider the bison sacred?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now listen to this. There's a guy, Wes Olson, who used to run. He used to manage the Elk Island um, uh, uh, game park, here to the west of Edmonton, and looking after all the bison there. That's one of the last pure herds of bison left in North America. He was also instrumental in helping the Saskatchewan Grassland National Park reintroduce bison there. And he now lives in Saskatchewan. He's retired now. Well, you know what he says? He says that bison are a keystone species. I know.
I would have been blown away by that if it wasn't for the fact that Charles C. Mann already let the cat out of the bag. In 1491, he explains precisely how the bison were and how they were actually the sort of indigenous people of the Americas. They opened up through burning and other things. They opened up all sorts of land to the bison to deliberately to expand their range so that they would be so that the bison were extended all the way into New York State, right?
Yeah.
Places where they had not been before, and this was all done by burning and actively encouraging them to come so that they could easily get to them when they wanted to eat them. Like farming them, basically.
I know, exactly. Well, the thing is that if you look at this data long enough, you eventually realize that the domestication of a number of species of what we now consider livestock and so on, the dog is a whole other story, but anyway, that's just a continuation of the same kind of ecological engineering and management. It's an intensification. It's not a brand new thing.
Mm-hmm.
Because of density. Because human beings were living more densely, they were exploiting more intensely the areas where they had to get their material from, and as a result, they had to manage more carefully. And when you manage more carefully, that usually means you spend a lot more time with these animals, right? Spending a lot more time, with the local herd of sheep or cows, wild cattle, moss taurs, whatever.
Yeah.
Who are you going to get rid of in that herd? Who is going to be, the target when you go to hunt one? It's going to be the big, aggressive, dangerous bull, right? Or the most dastardly, nasty cow, the one that killed your kid last year.
Yeah.
When he was just innocently sitting beside you and you'd gone to sleep, or whatever. You're going to get rid of the most aggressive, right? Getting rid of, many, many generations of getting rid of really, really aggressive individuals out of a population of animals reduces certain gene frequencies that are associated with parts of the regulatory mechanism of fetal growth that we call, I can't remember the name of it now, it's the neural crest, okay? It turns out that the adrenal gland, pigment, melanin production in the body, and gut cells, and pigment that is on the fur and on the skin, these are all part of a similar gene complex that is in the fetal development stage, very, very important in the animal's, development as a baby cow or whatever. All domestic species of animals show a reduction in the reactivity of the adrenal flight-fight reflex.
Mm-hmm.
But this has costs, because what it means is that these animals will also show a reduction in pigmentation. That's why you get spotted domestic animals and solid color wild ones usually. It also causes a reduction in cartilage, bone cartilage. This is why a lot of domestic animals have, floppy tails and ears and are not as fast and as tough as the wild species in the same kind of environment. You get a reduction in gut cell metabolism. I'm not sure exactly all the details because I'm not a microbiologist of the gut, but apparently, for instance, on some of the ranches in North America, they're favoring spotted, like piebald, and pure white versions of white-tailed deer. But it turns out that these animals have a much higher mortality because they are very susceptible to bloat and gut diseases and diseases where they can't digest certain foods and so on. I'm not sure all the details, but they have it introduces a kind of weakness into their bone structure and into their gut, and of course they're much more susceptible to heat or rather sunlight exposure. They get burns on their skin.
Yeah.
Like
this is all sort of an extension of what was his name? It's like Dmitry Belayev, the Soviet
who did the fox experiment.
Yeah, who did the fox, where he showed how you could like domesticate foxes and what was it, like 20 generations by just selecting for the animals that were more docile, that were not very afraid of humans and not very aggressive, and you would just select for those, and you could take a wild fox and turn it into a domesticated, basically lapdog, very quickly.
There's a book, How to Tame a Fox and Build a Dog, right? And that book is very widely acclaimed.
I haven't read that. Yeah.
Sorry, and it's the floppy ears, the waggy curly tails, the change
in dappled appearance, exactly like you said. Like these wild foxes that were uniformly black suddenly got white spots and things like that.
Yeah. So, that process follows from selection for an animal that's not going to deliberately either be very, very frightened of you and be impossible to manage, to watch, because it reacts, or very, very aggressive towards you. The flight-fight reflex is modified in these animals. And so, that gives a different sort of, you present what I call the anthropology of humans since the beginning of the Holocene, particularly involving domestication and much, much closer management of domesticated breeds to form the basis of food staples. That emerges absolutely predictably from more and more sedentism and more dense settlement.
Yeah, we're definitely gonna have to talk at least one or two more times because there's so many questions that I wanted to ask you that we didn't even have a chance to get to. But I want to finish with this sort of anecdote and just tell you see how you would respond to this. So recently we elected this very sort of environmentally conscious green government here in our neighborhood in Montreal, in Plateau Montréal, called Projet Montréal. And one of the things that they've done is they've just planted so many corners, for instance, on the corner of our street where Laval Avenue meets Roy Street, they extended the corners and just planted huge amounts of flowers and plants and things like that. They've just greened up this neighborhood like crazy, and it's very, very beautiful. But so something happened the other day. So I'm just walking to the corner store to get some milk or something like that, and I look over and there's this guy, and he's like cutting these yellow, beautiful flowers. These, I guess they were some kind of lily or something like that. He's cutting them and putting them inside a bag.
Mm-hmm.
And I was staring at him, and I said, like, what are you doing? And he said, oh, I'm just collecting them to eat. And I said, are you like hungry? And he's like, no. And so I was really irked by this, because on the one hand, but I was also kind of confused, because on the one hand, like I like the idea of having edible landscapes, and I like the idea of permaculture, and I definitely go into nature parks in Montreal, and I eat sometimes. There's black raspberries all over the place, and I eat tons of them, and they're all over the place. Yep. I'm not collecting them and bringing them home. I'm just eating them I'm grazing basically as I walk around.
Yeah.
But so this guy's like collecting these flowers, and he said, "Do you have a problem with that?" I said, "Yeah, I kind of do, because I figure, like we pay all of these taxes to this municipality and to this borough. And we pay a lot of taxes here, and these taxes are going into planting all of these plants, which are reducing the amount of city heat, and they're pretty, and they're doing all these things. And this guy's like collecting them. And he said to me, he's like, well, look, I'm only taking like 5% of the flowers from every corner. But he was going all over the neighborhood and collecting these. And he said, I'm just getting them to put into salads and things like that. So I walked away, and I was kind of grumpy, and so I actually I called the producer of the podcast, Sebastian, and I said, Sebastian, what do you think about this? And I took a picture of the guy doing it, and I sent Sebastian a picture, and I said, like, I'm really pissed off about this. And he said, yeah, that's ridiculous. He's like, what if everybody did that? So then I was kind of wrestling with this, and then sure enough, about an hour later, I'm walking by Centre Paul Roulant, which is a really wonderful place in our neighborhood. And who do I see at a stand selling these things? With the same guy. Yeah. And he's got them, and he's like selling a bunch of stuff, and he's selling these flowers. And I was so angry. And then I went home, and I told Annalisa, and she was like, she's all into like urban agriculture. And she said, well, we kind of want people to... And I said, but think about it. With the population density that we have in Plateau Montréal, this is the most densely populated electoral district in Canada. So if everybody were on their way home from work to just clip, let's say, 4 or 5 of those flowers because they want to have some nice flowers in a vase on their table, there would be no flowers by the end of the day. Like, they'd be all gone, right? So, and this guy, if he's collecting them to put in salads or to sell, if everybody does that, or even not very many people do that, they're all going to be gone for everybody, right? And this seems to me to be fundamentally a scaling problem.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you had a smaller community in the Kalahari or in some small town, in rural Alberta or, whatever, then having people graze these things the way I graze the wild black raspberries when I'm in the large nature parks, it's not a big deal. Right? So I just wonder, and this is the fundamental question that the whole Borlaug and Voigt opposition is, you have found all of these beautiful, and we have not even begun to exhaust all the things that I want to talk to you about your field experience, but you've discovered all these beautiful things about what humans can do based on what they are doing in the Kalahari, right? And I'm just wondering, is this so much a scaling problem that there's not really anything that you learned there that is going to be of practical... I mean, it's interesting, it's fascinating to know what the possibilities of the human species are, but will any of this stuff be of use to Plateau Montréal in Montreal?
Oh, yes, absolutely. But to find the useful things, you're going to have to go to a different level of... hello?
Yep, I'm there.
A different level of research. And we can talk about that next time. There's a woman called Eleanor Ostrom who did this kind of research, and there's also a person called Robert McNeish. I have to answer.
Okay. Yeah.
And so, can we talk about that next time?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, I'll see you then.
All right. Take care.
Okay,
bye for now.